Hello and welcome to another devlog for the medieval fantasy game I'm making, or should I say medieval fantasy, because we're adding fauns to the game. Get it? So the first thing I'll do is to assemble and edit the faun sprites so that they'll work with the color replace shader in the game. Then I'll bring them into Unity and create a new race, which is basically just a scriptable object that stores everything needed to change the appearance of the characters. And I think I forgot to set the pivot points because this guy is looking like Jar Jar Binks or something. But now that that's fixed, we're able to randomize a bunch of different fauns. I think they look really cool, but that might just be because they're one of my favorite fantasy races.
So precious when you smile.
Either way, Water Witch and her team of artists have done a great job with these sprites, and they've also sent me a new background for the snow biome, so I'll add that to the game as well. I still need to do a lot more work on these environments because I haven't figured out exactly how to get the background sprites to look like they have the correct scale. I probably need to play around some more with the y-axis positioning of the sprites and with the parallax effect. But I'll do that at a later stage when I design the way environments are stored and linked to the map locations, because that's an entire video in and of itself. Anyway, this snow biome will be home to the Viking/Celtic inspired faction, but there will also be a minor faction of fauns living up in the snowy mountains somewhere in the northwestern part of the map. I haven't decided yet whether they'll be bandits or a mostly neutral faction, but they'll definitely be hostile towards the kingdom of Brewerian, seeing as the Brewerianites capture fauns and force them to live as serfs on their farms, or should I say farms. So returning to the overworld, there's a lot of confusion among people regarding what the gameplay here is actually supposed to be like, and I'm not surprised since I'm pretty confused as well. In order to best explain what I want to achieve with this game, I need to list the 3 things that I personally enjoy when playing games myself. These are dynamic sandboxes that change without any input from the player, unique factions with conflicting goals and ambitions, immersive and lore-heavy worlds that feature stories with political scheming.
Witcher, why have you come?
So what I'll try to do is to create a linear sandbox, where minor locations can change dynamically, but major locations will require the player to complete quests in order to trigger an event where a change occurs. This way, the world will respond to NPCs' actions to a certain extent, but rely on the player to make decisions for how the major story beats play out. I'll do a bit of thinking now and come up with a few different location types that could exist in the world. Alright, I've got some ideas for locations here, and it might seem like it's a lot to implement, and it kind of is, but the main difference between them is mostly visual, since they'll all just provide the same basic power currency the factions used in Spartacus' war to spawn troops. The way these locations will be unique instead is in terms of which dwellers inhabit them. Dwellers are basically just wanderers that never leave the location they're in. They provide the player with services such as healing and trading, and minigames such as arena tournaments and fishing, because every game needs a fishing minigame. So I'm thinking that the overworld should function similar to a main menu. The player is free to choose which game mode to play. They can progress through the story, engage in some territory conquest gameplay, become the grand champion in the arenas, or do some simple base building at their headquarters. Alright, I forgot to mention that one of the major locations is a village that the player will come into possession of early in the game. There will be dwellers there that can be upgraded similar to the helper characters you had in Gladiahopper's career mode. Alright, so with a better understanding of how the overworld gameplay should be like, let's actually create something. I'll first make a text notification system that can be used to display things that are useful for the player to know. The reason I start with this is because I can use it as a debug notification tool as well when I implement all the other features in the future. So I wrote a script that is probably way too convoluted, and I ended up with this. I did some tweaking and added an icon that I can change depending on what type of event the player is being notified of. Now, this got me thinking that I'll also need to make a pop-up notification for when something happens that is so important that it needs to pause the game and have the player make a decision, similar to how it's done in Crusader Kings. But before worrying about that, I should create some actual overworld mechanics. So first, I'll add the ability for characters on the map to attack other characters and conquer locations. AI fights won't be resolved instantly like they were in Spartacus War though. Instead they'll stay next to each other for a while with their health bars visible and maybe an icon showing that they're engaged in combat. So after a day or so, I've got the basics working. I've set all major factions to be hostile to each other so that I can test out the overworld battles, but in the final game they're probably going to start at peace and wars will break out semi-randomly over time. Locations get conquered instantly right now because I haven't populated them with any dwellers yet, so I'll take care of that now. I've created an editor script that adds dwellers to every location with the press of a button. Eventually I'll go through and edit them so that they're all unique, but again, for testing purposes, I'm just doing some random generation here. So now, if a location is attacked, there's a guard dweller that defends it. I've also created these little text pop-ups so that you can better see what's going on. Together with new sound effects in the future and maybe some subtle animations for the icons, I think that these battles are going to look really good. Speaking of the icons, you might have noticed that I've done some work on them as well. I'm not too concerned about the art here since I won't be the one making the final version of it, but what I do need to think about is how to lay everything out in order to cleanly display the information that needs to be visible to the player. The type of character it is communicated partly by the headgear they'll be wearing, but I've also tried to symbolize it by having them hold different items in their hands. Furthermore, their faction color is displayed on this banner and the health is positioned below it. I'm actually not very happy with how it looks, but I can't think of any way to improve it right now, so I'll distract myself a bit by implementing some new equipment that was just sent to me by the artists. This equipment all belongs to one faction, and as you can see it's divided up into these different unit outfits. So I'll also take this opportunity to first organize the rest of the equipment, since I started doing that in an old devlog but never finished. After debating with myself what the best way to categorize everything was, I decided to lay the equipment out according to the faction and culture it belongs to. I use an atlas in Unity to pack all the sprites, so it shouldn't matter if I import images with lots of empty space in them, since they won't be included in the build. Then I go through everything and manually mark the pivot points so that the equipment gets properly positioned on the characters in the game. This part of my workflow is absolutely atrocious, but I don't really have a clean solution to this problem, so I'll just have to live with it for now. I repeated the same procedure for the new faction equipment in a separate image, and after way too long, I'm finally ready to bring everything into Unity. This might be a good time to show you the equipment naming convention I came up with, since that's another thing that I brought up in a previous devlog but forgot to come back to. It turns out that this is something that sounds like a good idea, but in practice it's really complicated to follow. So instead I'll only loosely adhere to it and just try to give each piece of equipment a unique name that makes sense to me. Now returning to the units, each major faction will have 5 tiers of combat units that they can pick from when spawning a character onto the map. So I made a new scriptable object to contain the data for whatever equipment I want the units to have. Using IDs to reference the correct items in the database like I do here is probably not the best idea though. It's not human readable and making edits in the future will be very cumbersome. So somewhere down the line before I add more factions I need to come up with another solution. Maybe a dictionary with slug strings as keys or something like that. I can't really find any information on how big games handle this, so if you're sitting on this knowledge please share it in a comment down below because I'd be very interested to know. Anyway, the different tiers of units now spawn on the overworld. I made it so that all factions make use of these outfit templates, but obviously later on they'll each have their own. Dwellers now also assign themselves equipment using these scriptable objects, but they too will have their own unique outfits in the future. I might also make the equipment be slightly randomized so that the same units don't all look identical like they do now, although that's not exactly high priority at this moment. Instead, I like to start closing some of the game loops so that I can actually have this game be playable in the near future. To do that, I will link together the overworld and the battle scene. But that's the topic for the next devlog, so subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to stay updated with the release of these videos. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.